Okay. So we have Dr. Palani Raman, who is actually a practicing pediatrician, and he's quite a popular person in many panel discussions in the ID chapter of Tamil Nadu state. And so he's a practicing pediatrician from Dindivanam. And we also have Dr. Valsan Verghese, who is actually a pediatric ID specialist, and he is the head of our pediatric ID department at CMC Vellore. And we have Dr. Anila Chako, who's also a pediatric ID specialist. I mean, both of them have trained in Canada in pediatric infectious disease. And Dr. Anila is an associate professor at CMC Vellore. So what we're going to do today is to look at some, I mean, this was a topic given to me, which was infections in unusual sites. So I've sort of chosen some few cases which highlight that this topic. And for the sake of this panel discussion, what I'm going to do is to first put up the cases itself, and then I would ask the panelists for their opinion, and we will go on from there. So not all the cases are fully, not all the panelists know all the cases fully well. So, I mean, they will be giving some of their own input to all these cases. So can I ask Anila also to join? I mean, I know she's on the panel. If she can also switch on her video.
Anila, I'll just ask her to.
It's on. I'm here. Can you see me?
Okay, great.
Yeah,
okay, thank you, Anila. So we'll start off with the first case. The first is it's a 1-year-old boy who presented with a fever of about 18 days. And neck swelling for about 7 days. He also presented with 2 days of noisy breathing. And this is the child. You can make out that there is some sort of a swelling at the side of the neck. Can I ask Dr. Valsan, what would you consider in this child? What will be your differential diagnosis, and how do you think you'll approach this child? So the child is a 1-year-old with fever for a prolonged duration and the shorter duration of neck swelling and noisy breathing, and has the swelling by the side of his neck.
So actually the differential fever for 18 days, first question I would ask, has the child received any antibiotics? The second thing is the swelling, whether it has been progressively increasing. And then what worries me is the noisy breathing. So normally if you had fever, cough, and noisy breathing, you would think of laryngotracheobronchitis, but when you have a neck swelling, so you would think of pharyngitis, you would only have drooling, you should not have noisy breathing. A paropharyngeal abscess could have noisy breathing. And in that picture, you can't really make out whether there's any parotid swelling, but the earlobe doesn't appear raised. So whether there is something within the throat. The other question I will ask the mother is the child drinking? Is the child drooling? Is there any difficulty swallowing? So, and if this so my differentials, I would think of any abscess within the oral or cavity, or and then the other thing is, of course, whether there is, because of the swelling, whether there are any lymph node enlargements.
Okay, so I think that's fair enough. I think we need to actually consider next phase infections because of the swelling and this and the prolonged fever as well. So what investigation would you like to do next?
Normally, if I thought of a pharyngitis, I would look at the throat. But this noisy breathing is actually worrying me, because noisy breathing and stridor, the classic teaching was, if you have an acute epiglottitis, you don't look at the throat unless you are ready to intubate. So, if I find that the node is not enlarged, there's just noisy breathing and a diffuse swelling, I would actually, if I'm thinking of a, retro or a parapharyngeal abscess, I would think of doing an X-ray, lateral X-ray of the neck.
Okay. And would you consider diphtheria in this case? Because that seems to have a resurgence over the past few,
Yes.
I think, years. So is that something that should be considered as well?
I think so. Definitely, especially if you're
Yeah.
looking at the throat and I find a membrane, then diphtheria would be high on the list of possibilities.
Yeah, I think the issue with stridor, I think that's a worrying sign. The only thing is acute epiglottitis. It's a very short illness, and they don't usually become so. I mean, they don't go on with fever for a prolonged period of time and then develop stridor. Acute epiglottitis, they are sick very fast, and also with the hip vaccination, hopefully that's not the issue. So these are some of the investigations that have been done. So the hemoglobin was 9.8 grams per deciliter. Total count was 19,200, showing that there is some evidence of a bacterial infection. Differential count showed 60% neutrophils and 30% lymphocytes. The platelet count was elevated, which probably could be due to iron deficiency, or it could be due to the inflammation itself. So there was an lateral X-ray of the neck taken. Dr. Palaniraman, can I ask you to comment on this X-ray and what do you think about this X-ray, and why would you, if it's abnormal, why would you consider it as abnormal?
Having the history known and the clinical examination findings known, I was expecting a retropharyngeal abscess in the X-ray neck in the lateral view. So as you see, you can see the loss of the lordosis in the cervical spine. The child is actually straightened cervical spine because of the muscle spasm, number one. Number two, the retropharyngeal space is widened, and this space is around more than, actually normally the space should not be more than the breadth of the vertebra, a cervical vertebra. Here it is more than twice or thrice of the breadth of the vertebra. That shows that actually there is something going on in the retropharyngeal space. So these are the two things commonly we will be able to find it out. Mostly we will be able to do. We are dealing with a case of retropharyngeal abscess or retropharyngeal cell rate.
Yeah. So as Dr. Palaniraman rightly mentioned, so this is a child with a retropharyngeal abscess, and the things to note are the loss of lordosis as well as the retropharyngeal space being wider. That is, anything beyond the size of the vertebral body, that will be actually considered as significantly enlarged. And in this case, it's much more than the width of one body. So Dr. Anila, can I ask you, in this child, how would you approach treatment? Okay. I'm not sure whether Anila might have got disconnected, I think.
She's coming now. She is coming.
Okay.
Yeah, she is there.
Hi. Sorry, I just got disconnected.
Yeah. Anila, can you, so we were just discussing this retropharyngeal space being widened.
Yeah.
So, what empiric antibiotic would you choose, and why would you choose such antibiotics?
So, when the space is widened, definitely, it points towards a retropharyngeal abscess. So, the organisms which cause retropharyngeal abscesses, one is group A strep, and the second is the anaerobes which are there in the mouth, the oropharynx, and then Staph aureus can sometimes come there. So these are the common organisms which I would like to cover. And so when you think of something which has anaerobic cover and cover for group A strep, then something like either clindamycin with ceftriaxone, or even augmentin, amoxiclavinec high dose. But having, if I was giving something without an MRSA cover, I'd probably add vancomycin. So those are the antibiotics I would use, and that's why.
So this child was actually treated with ceftriaxone and clindamycin. And there was no drainage which was done, and the child got better after that. So, like Dr. Anila mentioned, I think it's important to consider that all these retropharyngeal abscesses, the main organisms which cause retropharyngeal abscesses are the oral commensals, oral commensals, and of course the pathogenic organisms being group A Streptococcus, Staph aureus, and oral anaerobic mycobacteria, especially Fusobacterium, Prevotella, Veillonella. So all of them will be covered by clindamycin. And ceftriaxone, of course, I mean, if you have, it will have some amount of MSSA cover as well as group A strep cover. So I think this is a reasonable choice, and coamoxiclav would have been okay as well, but with the caveat that it will not cover MRSA. I just want to ask Dr. Palniraman, I mean, did you consider incision and drainage at all? Or
Actually, as a practicing pediatrician, after diagnosis, I referred the case. What happened? Then I followed the case. What happened in the institution? The higher institution, they gave the IV antibiotic, ceftriaxone and clindamycin for a period of a week, and they decided about the surgery, particularly for the thing. When they went to the theater and they found it was actually subsiding, and they finally came out of the theater, and the baby responded only with the oral antibiotic, settled with the antibiotic itself.
Okay, so. Okay, I think that's a good point, because not all retropharyngeal abscesses require surgery, and this is a suggested algorithm which you may use to actually treat retropharyngeal abscesses, because it could just be a phlegmon. I mean, phlegmon you cannot anyway drain because it's just like a solid inflammation. So if there is a phlegmon, then I think a trial of empiric antibiotic would be good. And if there is no improvement, then a CT chest would be required. And if there is an abscess, and if the abscess is more than 2.5 centimeters in size, that would require surgical drainage. And if not, it can continue the antibiotic. So it is likely that this was just a phlegmon which got improved with the antibiotic. So indications for surgery would be airway compromise. I mean, I understand the stridor in this case was a thing to worry about. And like Dr. Palniraman did rightly, I think he referred the child to a place where there was facility for all of that. And if you have the size of the lesion more than 2.5 centimeter cube, and it's well formed and into an abscess, that's a reason for drainage. And if there is failure of IV antibiotics also, that's an indication for drainage. So the differentials, I mean, Dr. Walson had mentioned, so anything that causes upper airway obstruction, sore throat, or neck stiffness can actually be a differential for retropharyngeal abscesses. It could be epiglottitis, croup, bacterial tracheitis, peritonsillar abscesses, laryngopharyngeal diphtheria, which is coming back in a big way. So that's something to worry about. Trauma, even anaphylaxis causing angioedema, and or tumors also can be in the differential. So
Winsley, can I add one point? Can I
yes,
add one
sir.
point? Because in the last 1 year, I had met with around 3 cases of retropharyngeal abscess. One was this case, and another case, what happened, it was just a febrile, irritable child, little around 4 to 5 years of child with only the node in the lateral aspect. Because of the CBC showed neutrophilic leukocytosis with thrombocytosis, thought of as a Kawasaki, and referred, and finally turned out to be a retropharyngeal abscess. Sometimes before going for the non-infectious causes, always try to rule out such a cases are like retropharyngeal abscess. Another case like had only a noisy breathing, just a subtle noisy breathing for a period of 15 days with on and off fever, and finally turned out to be a retropharyngeal abscess. So retropharyngeal abscess is not so uncommon. You should always have in mind whenever you have a noisy breathing with fever or high fever with neck nodes, or this is the situation we should have in mind. That is the message I want to say.
And also in this child, the fever of 80 days makes me a bit concerned about workup for tuberculosis, because tuberculosis also can actually present with, especially those with involvement of the cervical spine, can present with retropharyngeal abscesses. But in this case, looks like it was just a bacterial infection. So the next case, we will move on to the next case, which is a 3-year-old child who presents with fever for 3 days and neck swelling for 2 days, and this child also had drooling for 2 days. And this was the picture of the child. You can make out that there is like a significant amount of swelling in the submandibular as well as the submental regions, and the baby seems to have some difficulty in opening its mouth as well. So, Walson, can I? So, what would be the differentials and how can these different?
Sorry, what is the question again?
Differentials of the such neck swelling, submental, submandibular swelling.
Questions, differentials, yeah,
Oh.
submental, yeah.
So this, actually submental or submandibular lymphadenopathy, parotitis, secondary, bacterial parotitis, but because it is diffuse and bilateral and associated with fever, first diagnosis would actually be a Ludwig's angina. So a differentiation would actually rest on whether there is lymphadenopathy or no lymphadenopathy, and sometimes it's difficult to make out when you look at it clinically. So sometimes an ultrasound or something will actually help. But bilateral, I would actually go for Ludwig's angina as my first diagnosis.
So, Dr. Palaniraman, I mean, you treated this child. So,
Yes.
What did you treat with, and can you tell us why you chose that antibiotic?
Here, actually, the oral dental infection is the commonest cause for such a Ludwig angina. What happened in this child? The child was not toxic or sick enough. So I took a chance that I will start with the oral amoxiclav, which covers both the oral streptococcus, staphylococcus, as well as with the anaerobes, and with a high dose of oral amoxiclav, and with the frequent follow-up in the every day, every 24 hours. And finally, after nearly 48 to 72 hours, the child started settling, with the swelling started subsiding, and finally recovered without any other incision and drainage. The child settled with oral amoxiclav itself. But I was really worried whether the child goes for any respiratory compromise or anything. But as the child was not sick, I was able to manage as an outpatient in office practice itself. Winsley, I think Winsley is
Yeah, so this thing that Ludwig's angina doesn't support incision and drainage. Am I not audible? Hello.
now
you
you
are
are audible. Now
Am
you
I
are
audible now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So, I mean, I just want to reiterate that Ludwig's angina is usually doesn't suppurate, and usually you do not require an incision and drainage, and often it just settles down with antibiotics. And like you rightly said, again, it's a next phase infection, and the important organisms space infections as the anaerobes. And am I still audible?
You are intermittently audible. Your voice is breaking.
Okay. Let me see if I can actually. Okay, just give me a second. I'll just see if I can, if it makes it any better.
Walson sir,
Yeah.
in
Yes.
a lighter note, how common is Vincent's angina in pediatrics? Because like Ludwig angina, how common is Vincent's angina in practice? Because that is also a
Vincent's is, yes, yeah, I agree. So Vincent's is somehow less common. Both Vincent's and Ludwig's are associated with dental infections, like you rightly said, and you can actually have a gingivostomatitis. So if you have only carried, to be very frank, compared to retropharyngeal, all of these are uncommon, I would say, but Ludwig's is more common than Vincent's, and I would still say both are uncommon.
Okay.
I actually want to point out that point you made, Dr. Palniraman, about seeing so many cases which you had retropharyngeal abscesses which were not being suspected. The point I actually wanted to make is, it's quite, it's a, retropharyngeal abscess is commoner in children under 5 years of age,
Yes.
because they have a lot of nodes in the retropharyngeal and parapharyngeal spaces which involute after 5, like how the adenoids involute. Whereas Vincent's you can, and Ludwig's, you can have even after the age of 5. But I would still say Vincent's is even more uncommon,
Okay,
So,
thank you.
yeah. It's interesting because they are all the same
Boss, unmute.
organism.
Winsley, unmute. Winsley, unmute. Winsley, unmute. Winsley, unmute.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So thank you, Dr. Walson. I think those are very important points that you made. So I think next phase infections are actually, we should consider them to be one of the one of a serious concern, because they can cause serious infections. And these three spaces, especially the submandibular space, the parapharyngeal space, and the retropharyngeal space. So these are potential spaces. These are all areas where there are loose areolar tissue, which is actually get infected easily from the oral organisms. So moving on, this is a case of a 3-year-old boy who has a history of axillary swelling since 6 years of age. He was treated as BCG adenitis after a biopsy at around 1 year of age. He had no improvement, and he continued to, and the infection continued to spread to the supraclavicular as well as the pectoral regions. So this is a picture of his lesions. You can make out that there is this BCG scar, which is also sort of slightly VP. There are these lesions on the deltoid region, over the pectoral region, and over the neck as well. And you can see the biopsy scar at the left axilla. So my question to Dr. Palniraman, so when would you worry about BCG adenitis? I mean, I'm sure BCG adenitis is something that you see in your practice fairly frequently. And when would you worry about BCG adenitis, and how would you treat BCG adenitis?
In BCG adenitis, coming to the treatment first, usually I don't do anything. I don't do anything and usually wait and watch. Usually it will involute. If it is going for suppuration, non-dependent drainage or non-dependent needle aspiration, frequent needle aspiration I can do. No role of incision drainage. Unless it is very big, you have to go for excision rather than incision and drainage. This is the management aspect. Usually BCG adenitis and BCG abscess are common, but if the child is failing to thrive, we should always have in mind something is fishy, whether I'm dealing with the underlying immunodeficiency. So this is the point we should have in mind. If the baby is not failing to thrive and healthy, we can take chance. Mostly the child is having just a simple BCG adenitis.
So, Winsley, I just had a comment.
Yes,
that, first slide, I think it is from the first slide, I think it's mentioned 6 years. He must
6 months of age, sorry. 6 months of age. Yeah,
Sure.
yeah, I think that's a typo. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
it's
no,
6 months of age.
The panel, 2 people asked. Sure, go ahead.
Like Dr. Palniraman mentioned, I think BCG adenitis, there's really no role for any antibiotics or anti-tuberculous drugs are also often ineffective. If you have a good immune system, that will take care of it. And if there is a lot of suppuration, then you can aspirate it with a needle. And if there is, needle aspiration basically only prevents the discharge and its associated complications. It sort of shortens the duration of healing. And surgical excision can be done if the if the nodes are very large, but then, you have the risk of general anesthesia. So this child, this is the same child, you can make out the BCG scar. It is obviously abnormal for a BCG scar to be like this at around 3 years of age. Dr. Walson, when would you worry about a BCG scar? Walson, can't hear you. I don't know whether you're muted.
Yeah, sorry, I was mute. No, I would actually worry because that scar should have healed even with, what do you call a BCG adenitis going on, and BCG adenitis is usually single. It's axillary. It can be supraclavicular. It can be cervical. But to have all these areas involved, number one. Number two, to have the scar not healed, that to me indicates that there is some degree of immunodeficiency. And like Dr. Palniraman said, normally you don't get all this going on and on. It usually subsides. So the fact that it is there, I would worry about combined immunodeficiency or something else like a predisposition to persistent mycobacterial infection. There is something called an MSMD, Mendelian susceptibility to mycobacterial diseases. And this actually makes you susceptible to infections with, low virulence mycobacteria, such as the Mycobacterium bovis, which is found in the BCG. So I would actually definitely work for an immunodeficiency as my first point over here. The second thing is, if I have an abscess which I can drain, this one, because it's going on for so long, I will send it for a culture. And I want to know whether it's atypical. I want to know whether it's bovis. I want to know whether it's tuberculosis. One of the issues with the PCR, the expert is it complex, which includes bovis. So probably give me up.
Yeah, so I mean, moving on. I mean, I think you can make out. I mean, that was the front of the child, and this is the back of the child. There are multiple collections at the back as well. You can see one collection on top of the scapula also. So this child obviously had an extensive BCG infection. So we did a culture from that lymph node, and it actually grew Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and the expert was positive, and there was resistance to rifampicin. Dr. Anila, I mean, I just want your opinion on is this TB or is this BCG? How do we know?
Yeah, so M. bovis is what is there in BCG, and that is supposed to be intrinsically resistant to pyrazinamide. So when you see an MTB detected high, it actually means it's one of the M. tuberculous complex, and that includes M. bovis. Now, to sort this out, one would be to look at the pyrazinamide resistance when the sensitivity comes, if you have that. Or the other way of doing that is to do a PCR for M. bovis. And that would tell you whether it was Mycobacterium bovis. Yeah.
So I guess the point is that even though the expert is positive and the Mycobacterium culture is actually grown, it need not necessarily be TB. I think it will still be BCG. And like Dr. Anila mentioned, I think the pyrazinamide susceptibility is a surrogate to say that it could be BCG and not TB. But unfortunately, at that time in our lab, we were not doing pyrazinamide susceptibility. Another interesting point here is that, I mean, this is probably BCG because, I mean, you can make out that the BCG scar was so big. And also, I mean, everything sort of started off from the BCG region. And this was INH as well as rifampicin resistant. Now, is that something that can be considered? Can you have BCG, which is INH and rifampicin resistant? Dr. Walson?
It's rare. Like Anila said, I would actually expect pyrazinamide. I would not expect the rifampicin resistance. Isoniazid resistance can be there with M. bovis, but rifampicin is pretty unusual.
Yeah. So it is unusual, but then I mean, since we are dealing with unusual sites and unusual cases, so I thought so. I think it is very likely that this was MTR BCG, and it's been shown in many studies that people who have immunodeficiency generally tend to, I mean, because of the multiple courses of the antibiotics that they receive, they actually do develop resistance to rifampicin also. So you can actually have a MDR BCG problem. So, I mean, this is just to give you a flare of what, I mean, of the literature that's out there, which actually shows rifampicin resistance to BCG. So in this child, we did immunodeficiency workup. The total counts were okay. Differential counts were also okay. HIV was negative. Immunoglobulins were all within the normal limits. DHR was done, which was done to look for a chronic granulomatous disease, which again was negative. And the lymphocyte subsets was done to look for any features of SCID, and the numbers were all actually normal. We did a MSMD workup, like Dr. Walson mentioned. I mean, this was a Mendelian susceptible to mycobacterial diseases. And nowadays, it's easy to do this test with a next generation sequencing. And we found that this patient was actually IL-12 RB1 gene. There was a mutation, homozygous mutation, which was positive. And that was the reason he was developing all these abscesses in spite of our prolonged treatment. I just want to put up his growth chart. Dr. Palniraman mentioned that if there is failure to thrive, you should worry about immunodeficiency. But I can tell you that if for MSMDs, for some reason, if they have MSMD, even if they grow, I mean, they generally grow well. And it's only when they are very sick that they actually go off the growth chart. They generally grow well. But like you rightly said, I think with combined immunodeficiencies, they have failure to thrive. But with MSMDs, I mean, we've had many children that we've seen over the past few years with MSMDs. They somehow seem to grow well till they become very sick. This is the growth chart of this child. And unfortunately, this child, actually, we could not treat. We planned for a bone marrow transplant where they could not afford it. And then the child succumbed to this illness. But yeah, so this is just to highlight that BCG infection can progress. And if there is unusual BCG infection, you should suspect a primary immunodeficiency. So just to tell you a little bit about the complications of BCG, complications of BCG could be local, which could be abscesses, keloids, or ipsilateral lymphadenitis. Now, these can happen with people who are immunologically competent, whereas distant complications that, like, for example, osteitis or osteomyelitis can happen even in healthy individuals. And this is actually very common in the Scandinavian countries in the 70s and 80s. So much so, they stopped BCG vaccination in those countries because of these distant complications. Whereas disseminated BCGosis.
Excuse me, sir. Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
Sorry to interfere. We are getting many complaints that audio is not very clear. Can you cut down the video so it may be easy, especially
Okay.
Dr. Winsley? Yeah, thank you, sir.
Yeah. So just to tell you that with disseminated BCGosis, there is that is often associated with primary immunodeficiency. Now, moving on, this is just another, I mean, so this is a 12-month-old who's got fever for 8 days, red eyes for 5 days, right-sided painful neck nodes, and the lips are red and cracked. And the BCG scar is actually trying to reactivate. And you can look at the hands, which are actually, there is also some periungual desquamation. Can I ask Dr. Palniraman, so what do you think this could be?
This is Kawasaki unless proved otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, because when you have Kawasaki disease also, especially in infants, there is reactivation of the BCG scar. That's a very, very important point to note, that if you have Kawasaki and if you have, I mean, if you have fever and if you have reactivation of the BCG site, that's something to keep in mind. I mean, it's not always a BCGosis or a BCG problem. It could just be Kawasaki. So moving on, this is another child. I mean, I've got about 3 cases. I'm going to show you pictures of 3 cases. Wherever I've shown, I mean, always people have come back and said, oh, I've seen somebody like this in the past and we didn't know what it was. So that's why I'm actually included this in this. So this is a 20-month-old boy who had a swelling which was progressive for about 12 months. It started off with the buttock. He had IND done twice. There was no pus. When he came to me, he was actually unable to walk. He had no fever, no injury, no bite, and no other infections. This is the front. He had an indurated swelling which progressed to involve the scrotum. It was ulcerated. There was no regional lymphadenopathy. There was no palpable organomegaly, and he had grown very well. Some of the investigations, his total count was very elevated, 34,000. Differential showed significantly high number of eosinophils. Platelet count was also very high. We did an X-ray and that did not show any bony involvement. This is another case. This is a 3-year-old. Again, thigh swelling for a year, progressed to the buttock and scrotum. No other swelling, no fever. He's a well-grown child, but he had this non-tender induration involving the thigh, buttock, and scrotum. There were no regional nodes, no liver spleen enlargement. Here again, total count was elevated. There was eosinophilia. So can I ask Dr. Palniraman? So what would you think? How would you proceed with this child if you were to see this child in your clinic?
It may be two things, either a chronic infective process or a chronic malignant process. Because I have come across such a particularly like a gluteal region you have shown on swelling and finally turned out to be a sarcomas. But this can be, but the picture which you are showing, because it looks like some chronic infection, either a fungal infection or some unusual infection. I think so.
Dr. Walson, can I ask for your comments and how would you progress on with this child?
I actually don't have more to add than what Dr. Palniraman has said. What I would actually want to do now, I agree with him. Malignancy, he said sarcoma, I will add T cells lymphoma, and infections, chronic infections. Some of the things that can present with localized swellings could still be tuberculosis, could be fungal. Bacterial is unlikely, especially in the absence of systemic symptoms. So my next step would actually be to plan for, you said an X-ray was done. I would actually like to, if they can afford an MRI to look to see where the, swellings are, whether it is subcutaneous within the muscle or whether the bone is, there's some bony involvement, and then a biopsy and for histopathology and a culture. The culture I would actually send for bacterial, mycobacterial, and fungal.
Okay. So if you see, these children, actually, both of them had biopsies done. And on their biopsies, it actually showed broad aseptate hyphae. Now, Dr. Anila, what would you consider when you see broad aseptate hyphae on a biopsy?
Yeah, so what we would consider is something belonging to the mucor group, or a subcutaneous, what do you call it? Subcutaneous fungal infection, like an N of basically diseases like Basidio-bolomycosis and Conidio-bolus. But I think given this location, I think Basidio-bolomycosis is what is more likely. So these are subcutaneous fungal infections, and
so I think thanks. So as you rightly said, whenever you see broad aseptate hyphae, we should consider zygomycetes. And zygomycetes, the commonest things that we usually consider when we think about zygomycetes are actually mucormycosis. But mucormycosis usually happens in people who are who have some sort of a immune problem. Whereas subcutaneous zygomycetes, like you said, Conidio-bolomycosis and Basidio-bolomycosis, actually happen in healthy people also. It doesn't need to be there in people who are immunosuppressed. So this is another case. I will, this is actually somebody who sent me as a WhatsApp forward. I've just taken it ditto from that WhatsApp forward, including the pictures. And I'll ask Dr. Valsan to actually comment on this. So this is a 6-year-old girl who presented with bad cellulitis in her right calf region, which has been gradually worsening over 6 months. It did not respond to multiple antibiotics. There was broad spectrum antibiotics were started. Debridement was done. Pus culture grew Proteus vulgaris. Biopsy revealed extensive areas of necrosis with microabscesses and fungal elements which were aseptate. Conventional amphotericin was started and piptaz and amikacin for the Proteus. The lesions improved a bit, but then again became worse. He also developed fever, rash with amphotericin, so they stopped the amphotericin. So the questions are, would any other antifungal like posaconazole be useful, or is there any other differential to be considered?
So I
Well,
think
yeah.
this also fits in very well with the other two cases you presented. I mean, if you were to just do a broad overview, yeasts, you can divide fungi into yeasts and molds. Yeasts are classically Candida and Cryptococcus. Molds, if you were to say septate, they're usually Aspergillus and some of the Ascomycetes. The aseptate, like you said, are Zygomycetes, which is Mucorales and the Entomopterales. I would put this, especially with the subcutaneous location and the fact that it did not improve with amphotericin B, I would think of Basidiobolus. Conidiobolus usually involves the, it's enterorenal, it's actually sinus and can be GI. Basidiomycosis, again, very interestingly, treatment of choice is not amphotericin B because amphotericin B doesn't actually work well. What can be used for treatment for Basidiobolus, you have the options of potassium iodide, cotrimoxazole, and I think just recently ID Cases has released a series of cases of Basidiobolus, all of whom have been treated with itraconazole. So the third option are the azoles. There are some reports on itraconazole resistance. In this case, voriconazole is given, but potassium iodide and cotrimoxazole are still actually up there as very good treatment modalities. So that is what I would say. Differential diagnosis, consider Basidiobolus. Treatment modality, the amphotericin B is probably not going to work.
So this child, actually, I mean, I called this child back, and since this also the biopsy had already shown broad aseptate fungal hyphae, we treated with potassium iodide and Septran, and this is the Basidiobolus ranarum, which actually grew on a culture in the first patient. The second patient did not grow, but we had a broad aseptate hyphae on the biopsy. And just to summarize, pathogenic zygomycetes could be the mucormycosis or entomophthalomycosis. And here what we are talking about is entomophthalomycosis, which happens in people who are not necessarily immunosuppressed, and that is Conidiobolus and Basidiobolus. And this is a picture of somebody with Conidiobolomycosis. And what we've seen are Basidiobolomycosis. These are the two children who, after treatment with potassium iodide and Septran for 2 months, you can see it actually works like magic. In fact, a child who was not walking for 8 months started walking after 2 days of potassium iodide treatment. So this is the other child who was treated with potassium iodide. Both were treated for about 3 months. We monitored them for hypothyroidism, renal failure, and hyperkalemia, and they all did very well after that. Yeah. So
Winsley, I want to another one thing.
Yes, sir.
Sometimes we come across as cases of particularly non-tuberculous mycobacteria producing such abscess particularly in the when in the periphery, when they give the IM injection and following vaccination or anything, the gluteal abscess not responding to the regular IND or regular things. Sometimes non-tuberculous mycobacteria also is one of the diagnoses I want to think.
Yeah, I think the important thing is not you can't look at it and say that this is Basidiobolomycosis. I think the important thing is to say that if somebody comes like this, you need a biopsy. And once you've done the biopsy, you should send it for bacterial, fungal, and mycobacterial cultures, like Dr. Walson mentioned. And a definite differential is also a T-cell lymphoma, because they can also proceed on like this for many months with indurated skin lesions. So a biopsy is important, and then you can take it further. So the next case, this is of a 14-year-old boy who presented with back pain for about 4 months, fever for 4 months, and weight loss of about 20 kgs in 4 months. He had inability to sit for about 2 months. He had progressive weakness of both lower limbs. Bladder and bowel sensation were normal. His grandfather had tuberculosis when he was young. And incidentally, he also had sickle cell anemia, but had a splenectomy about 4 months prior to that. On examination, he looked very wasted. His tone was decreased in both lower limbs. His pain and touch were also diminished below the ankle. He had his plantar reflexes were absent, and he had a gibbous deformity in the mid back with a small ulcer and a left paraspinal swelling, which is 4 by 2 centimeters in size. He also had 3 centimeter hepatomegaly, and all the other systems were normal. This is his X-ray. Dr. Palniraman, I mean, in the periphery, if you were to actually in the outpatient practice, if you were to see a child like this, what differentials would you consider, and how will you manage this child?
First and foremost, I definitely come to the conclusion, mostly we are dealing with the part spine and the tuberculous paraspinal abscess, particularly when the AP X-ray definitely will show the abscess, fusiform abscess, it can really show. And with the given history of going for 2 to 3 months with the loss of weight and loss of appetite, first and foremost, we should rule out this thing, tuberculosis. But here the red herring, or I don't know, you are given the sickle cell anemia and the thing. So here definitely the definitive diagnosis only after the particularly the aspiration and the culture, then only we can have a definitive diagnosis, because you have given some sickle cell anemia, splenectomy, something can have unusual things can be grown also in this type of situation. So usually we are not going to handle, we are going to refer the patient.
Okay, I think that's a fair point. I think the important thing is it looks very much like tuberculosis. It looks very much like pot spine. Dr. Walson, I mean, how would you approach this child? I mean, since we work at a hospital.
I would definitely, want to delineate where the abscess is. Like I said, because of what Dr. Palniraman referred to as the red herrings, I would actually get our, spinal disorder surgery people to aspirate the abscess, send it for a bacterial culture, send it for, mycobacterial culture. For me also, the first diagnosis here would be a tuberculous spine. So, but the first thing is to get the pus, and if by any chance they are thinking of if any tissue is possible, well, a tissue, would also be perfectly good, but at least a bacterial and mycobacterial culture would be absolutely number one priority.
Would you start empiric anti-TB treatment?
No, this is not, because this is a situation where I can, it's gone on for quite some time. I'm not going to start empiric anti-TB treatment sitting in a tertiary care center. If I were in a secondary care center, if I were in a center where the patient says, I'm not going anywhere, doctor, you start, at that point, I would really be tempted to start anti-TB treatment, but in a tertiary care center, I would not, because, it's just that we've seen, things which mimic TB spine. So I would not start anti-TB treatment without getting a culture and, some definitive microbiological diagnosis.
So, I mean, this was the MRI which was done for this child. You can see the destruction of the L1 intervertebral disc and the vertebra. And also, there is a psoas abscess, which is actually there. And everything pointed towards TB. But of course, I mean, we never start on anti-TB treatment without trying to get a definitive diagnosis in the form of pus or biopsy. And here, sure enough, we aspirated it and it grew something which we were surprised about. that was Burkholderia pseudomallei, which is actually basically melioidosis. So even though everything looked like TB, the final diagnosis was melioidosis. So Dr. Anila, can I ask you, I mean, if somebody develops melioidosis, would you, what else would you consider and how would you treat these children?
So when we see melioidosis, I mean, in this child is a child who's had sickle cell anemia, right? So this child has had multiple blood transfusions. So one of the causes where these Burkholderia pseudomallei, they survive is, when in high iron containing areas. So I would definitely check the ferritin and see whether that was high. And if that was high as a source for this Burkholderia to grow, I would give some medication in consultation with hematology to decrease the iron stores. Now, the other places where you see, other than sickle cell and these hemoglobinopathies, where you see Burkholderia growing, are diseases, I mean, not necessarily pseudomallei. Any Burkholderia, you would definitely think CF, but that's not the case here. The other thing is immunodeficiencies. So immunodeficiencies like chronic granulomatous disease. So that is a condition where you have these organisms growing. And so these need to be ruled out in this child.
So we treated this child with ceftazidime for 2 weeks and followed by cotrimoxazole for 6 months. So this is the recommendation from CDC for treatment of melioidosis, which is basically IV treatment, which could be ceftazidime or meropenem, depending upon the sensitivity pattern. In our case, it was susceptible to ceftazidime, so we did treat with ceftazidime, and oral therapy with trimethoprim sulfa for another 6 months.
6 months.
So that's the treatment for this. And I think the risk factors for melioidosis are any chronic liver disease, renal disease, thalassemias. I mean, Anila did mention about recurrent transfusions and the high iron overload state, which predispose to melioidosis, cancers or other immunosuppressing conditions, and of course, things like cystic fibrosis and bronchiectasis. So I can move on to case 6 if there are no, I mean, can I just ask the organizers if we are okay for time? And if you think we are okay for time, then I'll move on to case 6. Otherwise, we'll stop because I think we've taken more than 45 minutes. Yes, Dr. Palniraman, please go ahead.
Actually, coming to the melioidosis, not only the immunosuppressed child and other conditions is common, particularly coming from the rural community, playing in the brackish waters, sometimes presenting with a rash and multiple abscess like a splenic abscess, liver abscess, lung abscess, cystic or cavitary lesions. We should always have in this mind, because long back, Dr. Ashwath from Coimbatore presented a case with coming from the rural community and finally gone to the Bangalore. Finally, Dr. Jagdish picked up with the blood culture and finally turned out to be a melioidosis, which such a, as you told, ceftazidime for 2 weeks and followed by cotrimoxazole for 6 months, situation settled. Sometimes even in a normal child, very rarely you can have such surprises. And the only blood culture proved the diagnosis. Otherwise, would not have proved the diagnosis.
Winsley sir,
I just want to add on. That's a very valid point, Dr. Palniraman, because even if you are not immune compromised, if the melioid is a soil saprophyte, it's found in the coastal areas. It's actually been found from soil in places like Kadalur and Tamil Nadu, in Kerala, places where children live next to paddy fields. So, anywhere that is marshy. So even a non-immunocompromised child can have melioidosis. Thank you.
Winsley sir, can we close it? We're already 1 hour into that.
Yeah. So I think we will stop here. I'll just go to my final slide, which is just to say, just to conclude.
Sir, we didn't want to interfere, but we have one more.
Yeah. I totally understand. So I'll just conclude. So basically, next phase infections we first looked at, and it is to say that they are dangerous infections, and treatment actually should include covering all the oral commensals, including anaerobes, and you should drain it whenever needed. If there is airway compromise, then definitely drainage is needed. Then we looked at BCG. If BCG abscesses or the BCG scar doesn't follow the usual course, think of primary immunodeficiency. Not all of them. I mean, you might still have a total normal and differential count. HIV may be negative, but MSMD is something that you need to consider. And it can be, you can make a definitive diagnosis using an NGS. Or if you have any long duration of infection, think about fungal infections, and a biopsy is crucial for diagnosis. And finally, we looked at a case of gibbous. Now, any gibbous, it's not always TB. It's always better to make a definitive diagnosis and rather than giving empiric anti-TB therapy.